The institution of slavery, a dark chapter in human history, left an indelible mark on the Americas. The United States and Brazil, two nations built on the backs of enslaved Africans, offer compelling case studies in the complexities of abolition and its aftermath. While both countries ultimately outlawed slavery, their paths to emancipation differed significantly, shaping the social, economic, and political landscapes for generations to come. This essay delves into the divergent trajectories of slavery's end in the United States and Brazil, examining the historical context, key figures, and enduring legacies that continue to shape the lives of black populations in both countries. By comparing and contrasting these two nations, we gain a deeper understanding of the forces that perpetuated slavery, the struggles for freedom, and the ongoing fight for racial justice. Examining the nuances of abolition in the United States and Brazil sheds light on the persistent challenges of inequality and the imperative for social change. Through this exploration, we confront the uncomfortable truths of the past and illuminate the path towards a more just and equitable future for all. Understanding the historical context of slavery in both countries is crucial. In the United States, slavery was deeply intertwined with the economy of the South. Plantations relied on enslaved labor for the production of cash crops like cotton and tobacco, fueling the wealth and power of the planter class. In Brazil, slavery was similarly entrenched, particularly in the sugar and coffee industries. Vast plantations dotted the Brazilian landscape, relying on the forced labor of Africans to produce commodities for the global market. These systems of exploitation, though geographically distant, shared a common thread: the brutal dehumanization of African people for economic gain. Examining the similarities and differences in the institution of slavery in the United States and Brazil lays the groundwork for understanding the divergent paths to abolition and the long-lasting consequences for black communities. The year 1500, the Portuguese arrive in Brazil. This marks the start of a very dark time. At first, they forced the native people to work for them. The Portuguese were really harsh. They wanted a bright red dye called Brazil wood. It was valuable, so they made the natives get it for them. Explorer slavers called bandeirantes traveled around, capturing and enslaving indigenous people. But as the colony grew, they needed more workers. So in the mid-1500s, something terrible happened. They started bringing in Africans as slaves. This changed everything. These Africans were taken from their homes and families. They were forced to work on farms, mostly growing sugar. Sugar was a luxury in Europe, and everyone wanted it. So more and more plantations popped up, and they needed more slaves to work on them. Imagine the journey these Africans endured across the ocean. It was a nightmare. They were packed onto ships like animals, treated terribly, and many died before even reaching Brazil. Those who survived faced a life of hardship, cruelty, and the loss of their culture. They were no longer seen as human beings. This began a struggle for freedom that would last for centuries. The switch from native to African slaves shows how greedy and cruel the Portuguese colonists were. They only cared about profit, not about people. This is how Brazil became a country with huge inequalities between races, a problem that still affects us today. Sugar, called white gold, fueled the need for African slaves. Huge farms, especially in the Northeast, depended on their forced labor. For generations, enslaved Africans lived and died under the brutal cycle of planting, harvesting, and processing sugar. Their pain made the Portuguese rulers and a few rich plantation owners very wealthy. Then in the 1700s, gold and diamonds were discovered. This made the demand for slaves even higher. Minas Gerais, the center of the gold rush, saw a massive influx of enslaved Africans. Their lives were cheap. They worked in dangerous mines, risking their lives for the riches of others. During this time, slaves were also being bought and sold inside Brazil, making the system even stronger. As the gold rush slowed down, coffee became the new big thing. By the 1800s, Brazil was the world's top coffee producer. Plantations, especially in the southeast, relied on slave labor. Even though more and more people around the world wanted to end slavery, the demand for coffee kept millions of Africans suffering. The history of slavery in Brazil is tied to the valuable goods that shaped its economy. Sugar, gold, and coffee made a few people very rich, but at a terrible human cost. The impact of this exploitation is still felt throughout Brazilian society, a dark reminder of how their economy grew. Ending slavery in Brazil was a long and difficult process. There were fights within Brazil and pressure from other countries. Great Britain, which had already outlawed slavery, pushed Brazil hard to stop the slave trade. But Brazil relied so much on slave labor, especially for coffee, that it resisted change. The first step towards freedom came in 1871 with the Law of the Free Womb. This law said that children born to enslaved women after that year would be free. It was a good start, but it didn't end slavery itself. Many slave owners found ways to get around the law, and forced labor continued. In 1885, the sexagenarian law was passed, freeing slaves over 60 years old. This might seem kind, but it was calculated. Many older slaves were unhealthy and not as productive. The law simply shifted the responsibility of caring for them from the slave owners to a society that wasn't ready to help. Finally, on May 13, 1888, the Golden Law was signed, abolishing slavery in Brazil. Princess Isabel, ruling while her father was away, signed the law. This was a huge moment in Brazilian history. But the fight for true equality wasn't over. The effects of slavery were still felt everywhere, leading to racial inequalities that are still present today. Slavery in the United States wove a complex and tragic tapestry through the nation's history. From the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the colony of Virginia in 1619, slavery became deeply ingrained in the social, economic, and political fabric of the American South. The Southern economy, heavily reliant on agriculture, depended on the forced labor of enslaved people to cultivate vast plantations of cash crops, primarily cotton and tobacco. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 dramatically increased the demand for slave labor as cotton production soared to meet the needs of textile mills in the North and abroad. This dependence on slave labor created a powerful economic and political elite in the South, the planter class, who fiercely defended the institution of slavery as essential to their way of life. The lives of enslaved people in the United States were characterized by unimaginable hardship, brutality, and the denial of their basic human rights. They were considered property, bought, sold, and traded at the whim of their owners. Families were torn apart, their languages and cultures suppressed, and their labor ruthlessly exploited for the profit of others. Despite the horrors they endured, enslaved people found ways to resist their oppression, from everyday acts of defiance to daring escapes via the Underground Railroad. The institution of slavery in the United States was deeply intertwined with the nation's identity, leading to a bitter sectional divide between the North and South. The abolitionist movement, fueled by moral outrage and the belief in the inherent equality of all people, gained momentum in the North, challenging the South's insistence on maintaining slavery. This conflict over slavery ultimately culminated in the cataclysmic Civil War, a bloody conflict that would forever alter the course of American history. The abolition of slavery in the United States was a long and tumultuous process, marked by passionate activism, political maneuvering, and ultimately, a bloody civil war. As the abolitionist movement gained traction in the North, the South dug in its heels, defending slavery as an economic necessity and a cornerstone of its way of life. Key figures emerged as powerful voices in the fight against slavery. Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man who escaped to freedom, became a towering figure in the abolitionist movement. His eloquent speeches and writings exposed the horrors of slavery and advocated for the equality of all people. Harriet Tubman, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, risked her life repeatedly to guide enslaved people to freedom in the North, embodying the spirit of resistance and courage. The issue of slavery increasingly polarized the nation, leading to escalating tensions between the North and South. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the expansion of slavery, in 1860, proved to be a turning point. Southern states, fearing that Lincoln's presidency signaled the end of their way of life, seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The secession ignited the Civil War, a brutal conflict that pitted brother against brother. In the midst of the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate territory shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. While the Emancipation Proclamation was a watershed moment, it did not immediately free all enslaved people in the United States. It was not until the Union victory in 1865 and the subsequent ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that slavery was finally and fully abolished throughout the nation. The end of slavery in 1888 didn't magically bring racial harmony to Brazil. Instead, people started talking about racial democracy, pretending that everyone was equal when they weren't. This idea, which many Brazilians were proud of, hid the real problems of racism that continued to harm Afro-Brazilians. Open and direct discrimination was frowned upon, but hidden forms of racism were everywhere. Afro-Brazilians had less access to education, healthcare, and good jobs. They were pushed to the edges of society, stuck in poverty, and denied the same chances as white Brazilians. The lack of real action to fix the damage of slavery, like giving land back to the descendants of slaves or paying reparations, made things even worse. The myth of racial democracy allowed those in power to ignore the deep injustices that held back a large part of the population. This created a society where racial disparities were not only visible but also deeply rooted. The fact that inequality still exists despite the idea of racial democracy shows that we need to talk honestly about race and make real changes. We must acknowledge the lasting impact of slavery and break down the systems that keep racial hierarchies in place. Only then can Brazil achieve true social justice and equality for all. The abolition of slavery marked a pivotal moment in American history, but it did not usher in an era of racial equality. The period following the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, was a time of both hope and bitter disappointment for newly freed Black Americans. Reconstruction efforts aimed to rebuild the South and integrate former slaves into society as citizens with full rights. The federal government established agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau to provide education, healthcare, and economic assistance to Black families. Black Americans embraced their newfound freedom with enthusiasm, participating in politics, establishing businesses, and seeking education. However, Reconstruction faced fierce resistance from white Southerners who resented the federal government's interference and the prospect of Black equality. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using violence and intimidation to terrorize Black communities and undermine Reconstruction efforts. As federal support for Reconstruction waned, Southern states implemented Jim Crow laws, a system of legal segregation that relegated Black Americans to second-class citizenship. These laws enforced segregation in public spaces, denied Black Americans access to equal education and economic opportunities, and stripped them of their voting rights. The legacy of slavery and the failures of Reconstruction cast a long shadow over the 20th century, fueling the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. While significant progress has been made in dismantling Jim Crow and advancing civil rights, the United States continues to grapple with the enduring legacy of slavery and the systemic racism that permeates its institutions. The journey to freedom was not a swift one. In both the United States and Brazil, the road was long and fraught with challenges. Emancipation did not equate to immediate equality. Former slaves faced systemic barriers that hindered their progress for decades. Yet, the resilience and determination of these individuals laid the groundwork for future generations to continue the fight for true freedom and equality. The socio-economic landscape for Black Americans and Afro-Brazilians has been shaped by centuries of systemic inequality. In the United States, the legacy of Jim Crow laws and redlining has left lasting scars on Black communities. In Brazil, the myth of racial democracy has masked deep-seated disparities in education, employment, and housing. Both nations continue to grapple with these issues, as activists and community leaders work tirelessly to close the gaps. The story of sugar and coffee is deeply intertwined with the history of slavery. For centuries, these crops fueled economies and dictated the lives of countless enslaved individuals. The labor-intensive nature of sugar cultivation required a vast workforce, leading to the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans. Coffee, introduced later, followed a similar path. Plantations spread across the Americas, and the demand for labor grew. Enslaved people were forced to work long hours under harsh conditions, with little hope for freedom. Despite the oppressive system, enslaved individuals resisted in many ways. From subtle acts of defiance to organized rebellions, they fought for their dignity and freedom. Their resilience and courage laid the groundwork for future generations to continue the struggle for justice. The abolition of slavery was a long and arduous journey. It required the relentless efforts of abolitionists, the bravery of the enslaved, and significant societal change. The legacy of sugar and coffee reminds us of the enduring impact of slavery and the importance of remembering this history as we continue to strive for a more just world.